Welcome to Fluent Daily, the English listening channel for advanced learners at B2 and C1 level. Every episode features a rich, flowing conversation in natural English on a topic that is genuinely worth thinking about: history, psychology, science, philosophy, and more. There are no simplified sentences here, no slow speech, no vocabulary drills. Just real English spoken naturally on ideas that matter. This is Fluent Daily. Let's get into it.
Today we have a great story, so let's get started right now. The meal you are going to eat tonight, like that basic Tuesday night chicken breast or bowl of pasta, is actually directly responsible for shrinking the human digestive tract.
Well, absolutely.
It sparked the transatlantic slave trade. It completely altered the Earth's atmosphere. We sit down at the end of a long day, and we just look at our dinner plates expecting simplicity, We see fuel. A simple biological equation of calories in, energy out.
Right, just a very mechanical view of it.
Exactly, but the reality is that the very concept of a meal is arguably the most violent, consequential, and really powerful technology humans ever invented.
It's the ultimate diagnostic tool for understanding who we are.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, when you look at a plate of food, you aren't just looking at macronutrients.
Yeah.
You are looking at a compressed archaeological dig, a political manifesto, and a biological blueprint all at once.
Yeah.
Because eating is purely about survival. But cooking, the creation of what every human society calls a cuisine, is something entirely different. A wolf tears into a raw carcass to survive. But a cuisine is this highly specific, culturally enforced practice of transforming raw ingredients into shared rituals. It organizes our social hierarchies, it mandates our daily schedules, and, it maintains the very boundaries of our communities.
Well, welcome to the deep dive. We are taking on a massive intellectual exploration today. We are tracing the profound, mostly hidden history of how the act of eating literally engineered human biology, redrew the maps of the world, and defined our cultural memories. And to figure out how your next meal connects to the deepest mysteries of what makes us human, we really have to start with the meal that quite literally built the human brain.
Yeah, and to find that specific meal, we look at the evolutionary biology paradigm that Richard Wrangham proposed back in 2009. It's known as the cooking hypothesis.
Okay, lay that out for us.
Well, the standard narrative we all sort of internalize is that hominins evolved, our brains grew large and complex, and then because we were so smart, we eventually figured out how to harness fire to cook a mammoth.
Right, like brain first, then fire.
Exactly. But Wrangham's hypothesis flips that causal arrow completely backward. He argues that the control of fire came first, and the cooking itself is what caused the massive brain expansion.
Which means we have to look at digestion not just as an automatic bodily function, but as an economic transaction.
Yeah,
Your body is basically an economy, and digestion costs a fortune.
it really does.
If you eat a raw fibrous tuber dug out of the savannah, or a tough piece of raw meat, your body has to do a staggering amount of mechanical and chemical labor just to extract a few calories from it. You are chewing for hours.
Hours and hours.
Your stomach acids are just working overtime. Your digestive tract has to be incredibly long to break down those thick plant cell walls. You are burning a massive amount of calories just to access the calories.
Right, but the physics of the situation change entirely when you introduce heat. When you cook that tuber or that meat, you are essentially outsourcing the first phase of digestion to the campfire.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
Yeah, thermal energy breaks down the rigid cell walls of plants. It denatures the proteins in meat, literally unwinding those tight, complex molecular bundles so your enzymes can access them easily. It gelatinizes starches, turning something hard and indigestible into a soft, easily absorbed paste.
So it's basically pre-digesting the food for you.
Precisely. So an early hominid eating cooked food gets a dramatic spike in their net caloric yield. They extract substantially more energy from the exact same volume of food with a fraction of the internal digestive effort.
And the human body only has so much energy to spend in a 24-hour period. We have two organs that are absolutely greedy for energy, right? The gut and the brain. There's this principle in evolutionary biology called the expensive tissue hypothesis. And the math there is brutal. You cannot physically consume enough calories foraging in the wild to power both a massive, heavy-duty digestive tract and a massive supercomputing brain. Something has to give.
Exactly. You just can't afford both.
Right. So by outsourcing the heavy lifting of digestion to the fire, our ancestors' guts physically shrank. And that newly freed up metabolic budget was instantly redirected to fuel the rapid expansion of the cerebral cortex.
And the implications of that metabolic swap are profound. Because cooking isn't just a cultural habit that early humans picked up once they were already human. Cooking is the primary biological driver through which the specific kind of primate capable of having culture came to exist.
Wow.
We basically cooked our way into humanity. The campfire gave us the caloric surplus required to evolve.
Okay, but wait, the timeline doesn't make total sense to me here.
How so?
Well, if you look at the fossil record, we see that transition, the shrinking jaws, the smaller teeth, the barrel-shaped rib cage that indicates a smaller gut, and obviously the exploding brain size. All of that is happening with Homo erectus around 1.8 million years ago.
Right.
But the archaeological record for ancient hearths, like the earliest unambiguous evidence of controlled fire, only dates back about 300,000 to 400,000 years. If our bodies radically transformed 1.8 million years ago, but we didn't have fire until 1.5 million years later, how does that math work? Did we just magically evolve on raw celery?
That is the big question. That gap in the timeline is actually the central battleground for paleoanthropologists right now, because the biological evidence heavily supports a dietary shift to high-quality, easily processed food 1.8 million years ago. But like you said, the physical evidence of fire is missing.
So how do they explain it?
This requires a deep understanding of taphonomy, which is the science of how organic matter decays, preserves, or fossilizes over time. Think about the physical composition of a campfire.
It's just ash, right?
Exactly. It's just ash and some lightly charred rocks. It is incredibly fragile. So, to expect a shallow pile of ash to survive wind, rain, glaciation, tectonic shifts, and microbial breakdown for nearly 2 million years, it's just an astronomical ask of the geological record.
Ah, I see. So the argument is that the early fires were there, the evidence just literally blew away in the wind.
That is the primary defense of the hypothesis, yes. The alternative view is that early Homo species achieved that initial caloric bump through intensive mechanical processing of food, using stone tools to smash tubers and slice meat into incredibly thin, easily digestible pieces, and that fire was adopted later, accelerating a process that was already underway.
Got it.
But regardless of how that specific timeline debate settles, the core mechanical truth remains. The processing of food outside the body is inextricably linked to the evolutionary trajectory of the human form.
That makes a lot of sense. And once that brain is burning 20% of your daily calories, you need a more reliable fuel source than just hoping to stumble across a ripe fruit tree or track down a gazelle. You really need a guaranteed return on your energy investment.
You do.
And that necessity drives us into what is easily the most misunderstood transition in human history: the Neolithic agricultural revolution.
Yes. The shift from mobile foraging to stationary farming, this occurred independently in places like Mesopotamia, Mesoamerica, and China between 10,000 and 5,000 years ago. And the story we all learn in school treats this as an absolute triumph for us.
Oh, totally. We planted wheat, we stopped wandering, we generated a surplus, and suddenly we had the free time to invent writing, mathematics, and complex cities. We won the evolutionary lottery.
That's the textbook version. But the physical reality buried in the dirt tells a totally different, honestly incredibly grim story. The anthropologist Mark Cohen documented this thoroughly back in the 1970s. When you actually dig up the skeletal remains of early farmers and lay them on a table right next to the hunter-gatherers who lived in the exact same region just a few centuries earlier, the farmers look awful.
Like physically deteriorated.
Yes, the physical deterioration is stark, and it's uniform across global sites. The skeletons of early agriculturalists reveal a significant reduction in physical stature.
Really? They got shorter.
Much shorter. Bone length is a highly reliable indicator of nutritional adequacy during childhood development. When the diet lacks essential amino acids and diverse vitamins, the body basically stunts its own growth to conserve resources. So the farmers were significantly shorter.
Wow.
Furthermore, their bones exhibit high rates of porotic hyperostosis.
What is that?
It's a spongy, porous condition in the skull that indicates severe, chronic iron deficiency anemia.
Because they lost all dietary diversity. A hunter-gatherer might eat, 60 different species of plants, nuts, and meats in a month? But an early farmer is just eating wheat porridge, morning, noon, and night.
Exactly. And the monotony of the diet wrecked their dental health as well. Pre-agricultural skulls rarely show significant cavities, but the shift to a massive carbohydrate dependency staple crops like wheat, barley, or maize bathed their teeth in sugars.
Oh, that sounds painful.
It led to widespread dental caries, abscesses, and premature tooth loss. And then on top of that, you have the biomechanical trauma. Early farming was completely unmechanized.
Just backbreaking labor.
Completely. The skeletons show severely flattened vertebrae, osteoarthritis, and repetitive strain injuries from the grueling daily labor of clearing land with stone axes, planting seeds by hand, and spending hours hunched over a saddle quern, grinding grain into flour.
And the environment they built was also a biological nightmare. They stopped moving around. They settled into dense, crowded villages, living side by side with their own waste and all these newly domesticated animals, pigs, cows, sheep.
Which is a recipe for disaster.
Exactly. You get zoonotic diseases, viruses and bacteria jumping from livestock right into humans. The skeletons show massive spikes in lesions related to infectious diseases that simply couldn't gain a foothold in small, mobile bands of foragers.
Right. So agriculture offered zero nutritional benefit to the individual. What it provided was an unprecedented caloric yield per acre of land.
The scale of it.
Exactly. A forest might provide enough wild calories to support 10 people per square mile. A cleared field planted with domesticated wheat can support 100 people per square mile. It allowed human societies to balloon in size, but it financed that population explosion by drastically lowering the quality of life, health, and physical well-being of almost every individual in that society.
It's so much like a tech startup that decides to pivot for the sake of hypergrowth.
Oh, that's an interesting comparison.
Yeah, the executives say, we are going to scale our user base by 1,000%. And they successfully get millions of new users on the platform. But the servers are catching on fire, the software crashes hourly, and the actual user experience is miserable.
Yes.
But the top-line metric, the sheer number of humans alive, looks like a massive success.
That's a perfect analogy. The historian Jared Diamond notoriously labeled agriculture the worst mistake in the history of the human race.
That's a strong statement.
It is, and while that is definitely rhetorical provocation, it highlights the agonizing trade-off. Without that dense, stationary population, you do not get the division of labor required to produce art, modern medicine, or the microphone you are speaking into right now. Civilization required the surplus. But the initial cost was paid entirely in human suffering.
But if the user experience was so terrible, why didn't the early farmers just quit? Why not look at the rotting teeth and the infectious diseases, throw down the stone hoe, and walk back into the forest to pick berries?
Because it's a demographic trap. The adoption of agriculture is a one-way street. Once a community settles and relies on the high caloric output of grain, their population rapidly expands past the carrying capacity of the wild environment.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, within just 2 or 3 generations, there are simply too many mouths to feed through foraging. The forest cannot sustain them anymore. The bridge is burned. Additionally, grain is unique because it can be dried, stored for years, and hoarded. And this physical reality creates the foundation for extreme social inequality.
Right, because you can't hoard dead mammoths, they rot. But you can lock 1,000 pounds of wheat in a stone silo.
And whoever controls the lock on that silo controls the society. Early elites, priests, kings, warlords realized that stored grain is a highly concentrated form of wealth. It can be taxed, it can be used to pay a standing army.
So they forced the system to keep going.
Exactly. The elites had a vested interest in enforcing the agricultural system because it consolidated their power, even as it degraded the health of the peasant class doing the actual labor.
Okay, so fast forward a few thousand years. These dense, highly stratified agricultural societies mature. They have massive silos of wheat, rice, and barley. They have all the calories they need to survive, but they're lacking something fundamental to the human experience of eating, which is flavor.
Right.
And the desire to make this monotonous diet actually taste good ends up redrawing the geopolitical map of the entire planet.
It really does. The catalyst for the first true era of globalized trade was the 15th century obsession with spices, black pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and ginger. These botanical products, indigenous primarily to South and Southeast Asia, became the central economic driver of European naval expansion.
It's almost impossible for us to conceptualize this today. I mean, I can walk into a supermarket, spend $4, and buy a jar of black pepper that will sit in my pantry for 2 years.
Right.
The idea that monarchies would empty their treasuries to fund incredibly lethal, globe-spanning armadas just to get a garnish for their roasted meats sounds totally absurd.
We really have to strip away our modern culinary context to understand it. In late medieval and early modern Europe, spices were not just about a dash of heat. They served a critical function in a world without refrigeration.
Right, preserving food.
Well, salt was the primary preservative, but heavy spicing was used to mask the intense, rancid flavors of meat that was on the verge of spoiling. Furthermore, the humoral theory of medicine, which dominated medical thought at the time, assigned deep medicinal properties to these lot dry spices, treating them as cures for everything from the common cold to the plague.
But above all, it was a status symbol, right? If you were a European aristocrat, serving a dish heavily crusted in nutmeg and cloves imported from an island 10,000 miles away was the ultimate display of wealth.
Oh, absolutely.
It was the medieval equivalent of wearing a bespoke luxury watch or driving a hypercar. You were literally consuming exotic wealth in front of your guests.
And the geopolitical bottleneck for all this wealth was the Ottoman Empire. The traditional overland trade routes from Asia, like the Silk Road, terminated in the Eastern Mediterranean. The Ottomans controlled these routes and acted as a powerful, monopolistic middleman, levying massive taxes on spices entering Europe.
And nobody wants to pay the markup.
Exactly. The Catholic powers of the Iberian Peninsula, Portugal and Spain, desperately wanted direct access to the source to bypass that Ottoman markup. This singular economic obsession drove the Portuguese to systematically map the western coast of Africa, eventually leading Vasco da Gama to round the Cape of Good Hope in 1498 and drop anchor in India.
And on the Spanish side, it drove an Italian navigator to propose a radically different, highly speculative route sailing directly west across the Atlantic. Christopher Columbus wasn't looking to discover a new continent.
Not at all.
He was executing a high-stakes, extremely poorly calculated grocery run. He was trying to find a shortcut to the spice markets of Asia. He accidentally slammed into the Americas, and in doing so, triggered what historians call the Columbian Exchange.
Yes, and the Columbian Exchange is the single most disruptive biological and cultural event in human history. It was a massive, unprecedented, and largely unintentional swap of flora, fauna, human populations, and pathogens between the eastern and western hemispheres. It re-engineered the global food system almost overnight in historical terms.
Let's actually look at the mechanics of this botanical swap because it destroys everything we think we know about traditional cuisine. From the Americas, European ships brought back plants that had never existed anywhere else on Earth. Tomatoes, potatoes, maize or corn, sweet potatoes, chili peppers, cacao, vanilla, peanuts, squash, beans.
And the mechanics of how these crops integrated into the Old World are fascinating. Take the potato, indigenous to the high-altitude, harsh climates of the Andes in South America. When it was introduced to Northern Europe, particularly places like Ireland and parts of Germany, it found a perfect ecological niche.
Oh.
The potato provides an incredibly high caloric yield in cold, damp, rocky soil where traditional wheat crops frequently fail. So the adoption of the potato effectively ended the cycle of routine famine in Northern Europe, allowing the population to explode, which subsequently provided the labor force necessary for the Industrial Revolution.
That's incredible. And look at the chili pepper. Before Columbus, there is not a single chili pepper in Asia. Indian food, Thai food, Sichuan cuisine, they generated heat using black pepper, ginger, and mustard. But the chili pepper, native to Mesoamerica, spreads rapidly through Asia in the 16th century via Portuguese trade routes.
And it changed everything.
Because unlike black pepper, which requires a highly specific tropical climate and takes years to mature, a peasant in India or China could take a handful of chili seeds, throw them in their backyard garden, and have a roaring harvest of intense capsaicin-rich heat in a single season. The chili pepper democratized flavor for the global poor.
It really did. And going the other direction, the Old World introduced wheat, rice, coffee, sugarcane, and the entire spectrum of domesticated livestock, cattle, pigs, horses, sheep, right into the Americas. The ecosystems of the Americas were transformed, often violently, to accommodate these alien species.
Think about Italian food without tomatoes. Think about the Irish without the potato. Think about Belgian chocolate, which relies entirely on cacao from Mexico. The foods that feel the most rooted, the most ancient, and the most quintessentially native to our cultural identities are actually just the recent byproducts of a 16th century global collision.
It's true. But while finding a route to black pepper was the initial goal of this exploration, the agricultural infrastructure built in the Americas ended up supercharging a completely different, infinitely darker commodity. If we want to understand the modern political economy of food, we really have to confront the history of sugar.
Yeah, no food has a more violent lineage. The industrial-scale cultivation of sugarcane in the Caribbean and Brazil became the central engine of the transatlantic slave trade.
Because sugarcane is a notoriously difficult, labor-intensive crop to process. Once cut, the cane must be crushed and boiled almost immediately before the sucrose ferments and ruins the yield.
You can't just harvest it and let it sit.
Right. This requires an industrial factory setup operating right alongside the agricultural field. So the European colonial powers engineered a labor regime designed to extract maximum profit through the systematic destruction of human life. The conditions in the boiling houses and the cane fields were so lethal that the enslaved workforce died at catastrophic rates.
It's horrific.
It is. To maintain production, the colonial powers constantly imported millions of newly enslaved human beings from West Africa.
Which created that horrifying economic loop known as the Triangle of Trade. European manufactured goods, like textiles and firearms, were shipped to Africa. Enslaved human beings were brutally packed into the hulls of ships and transported to the Americas. The sugar and molasses extracted through their tortured labor were then shipped back to Europe. The astronomical wealth generated by this specific caloric cycle funded massive portions of European commercial dominance.
The anthropologist Sidney Mintz tracks this evolution brilliantly in his 1985 book, Sweetness and Power. He analyzes the mechanisms by which sugar transitioned from a rare elite luxury to a mass-market necessity.
How did that happen?
Well, in the 1500s, European royalty used sugar to commission massive, elaborate sculptures for banquet tables. It was an object of pure spectacle. But by the 1800s, it had become the primary caloric fuel for the British working class.
And Mintz points out that this transition perfectly collided with the Industrial Revolution. The British working class was rapidly urbanizing, moving out of rural villages and into massive, polluted industrial cities to work in textile mills and coal mines. The Enclosure Acts had cut them off from the communal land where they used to forage, grow vegetables, and maintain that dietary diversity we talked about earlier. Now, they're working 14-hour shifts in freezing factories. They are exhausted, and they have no time or space to cook.
They desperately needed a cheap, instant source of energy. And thanks to the brutal efficiency of the plantation system in the colonies and new refining technologies at home, sugar was suddenly dirt cheap. Hot tea itself, an imported colonial commodity, heavily caffeinated and acting as an appetite suppressant loaded with massive amounts of refined sugar, became the literal battery power of the industrial worker.
It went from being the caviar of the elite to the cheap battery power for exhausted factory workers. It's an incredibly bleak irony. The working class didn't adopt a high-sugar diet out of a simple preference for sweets. They adopted it because industrialization had entirely hollowed out their traditional foodways. Sugar stepped into the nutritional void. It was the fastest, cheapest calorie available to keep a human body functioning on an assembly line.
And the legacy of that infrastructure is everywhere today. The modern global sugar industry, the massive political lobbying power it wields, and the consequent modern public health crises of obesity and type 2 diabetes, all of these are downstream effects of the systems engineered in the 18th and 19th centuries. The drive to produce massive quantities of identical, stable, highly processed calories didn't stop with sugar. It became the blueprint for the entire modern food system.
Because once humanity figured out how to mass produce and refine one type of calorie, we started applying that exact same engineering mindset to every single thing we eat. The mid-19th century sets off a technological arms race in food preservation and distribution.
It did. And those breakthroughs fundamentally severed the ancient limitations of geography and season. In 1810, driven by the French military's need to feed massive armies marching across Europe, the process of canning was developed. By isolating food in sterile environments, they finally conquered bacterial rot.
A huge leap forward.
Then in the 1850s, the development of mechanical refrigeration allowed highly perishable goods like meat and dairy to be transported across oceans without spoiling. In 1864, Louis Pasteur developed pasteurization, a thermal engineering process that extended the shelf life of liquids by neutralizing pathogens. Food transitioned from a fragile, localized biological product into a durable, globalized industrial commodity.
And then in the 20th century, we applied the philosophy of the factory floor directly to the soil. We brought in Frederick Winslow Taylor's concept of scientific management Taylorism.
Yes, efficiency above all else.
Exactly. This is the idea of breaking down a complex job into hyper-efficient, repetitive, easily measurable tasks to maximize output. We used it to build cars on assembly lines, and then we turned around and applied it to growing corn and raising chickens.
This industrial mindset really culminated in the 1960s with the Green Revolution. By the mid-20th century, global populations were surging, and demographers were widely predicting catastrophic, civilization-ending famines, particularly in Asia. The Green Revolution, led by scientists like Norman Borlaug, averted those famines through aggressive biological and chemical interventions.
Borlaug developed semi-dwarf, high-yield varieties of wheat, right? Because before this, if you pumped a traditional wheat plant full of synthetic nitrogen fertilizer, the grain head would grow so large and heavy that the tall stalk would literally snap in the wind, ruining the entire crop.
They just snap right in half.
Yeah. So Borlaug bred a plant with a short, thick, sturdy stalk that could support a massive grain head. It could absorb insane amounts of synthetic fertilizer and water without falling over.
Exactly. And the application of these hybrid seeds, paired with massive irrigation infrastructure and synthetic agrochemicals, so chemical fertilizers and pesticides, skyrocketed global caloric yields. The Green Revolution fundamentally expanded the carrying capacity of the planet. It is the primary reason the human population could grow from 2.5 billion in 1950 to over 8 billion today without widespread starvation.
But on one hand, the system feeds 8 billion people and stopped global famines. That is a massive triumph. But on the other hand, the environmental price tag seems absolutely terrifying. How do we hold both of those truths?
It's the central paradox of our time. The corresponding reality is that the ecological bill for that triumph is rapidly coming due. Agriculture currently accounts for 25 to 30% of total global greenhouse gas emissions.
That's huge.
It is. And the mechanics of these emissions are diverse. It is the massive release of methane from the digestive processes of billions of ruminant livestock. It's the nitrous oxide, which is a highly potent greenhouse gas volatilizing into the atmosphere from the millions of tons of synthetic nitrogen fertilizer dumped onto fields. And it's the carbon dioxide released when massive carbon sinks, like the Amazon rainforest, are bulldozed and burned to create grazing pasture or massive soy monocultures.
And the way we allocate the land we've cleared is terrifyingly inefficient, isn't it?
It represents a profound failure of resource allocation. Industrialized livestock production, the vast feedlots for beef, pork, and poultry dominates the landscape. The global livestock sector utilizes roughly 70% of all available agricultural land on Earth.
70%.
Yes, and this includes the land the animals live on and, crucially, the massive tracts of land used to grow the corn and soy required to feed them. Yet, despite monopolizing 70% of the land, this sector provides only about 30% of the total protein calories consumed by the human population. The thermodynamic loss of cycling plant calories through an animal to create meat is staggering.
We have engineered this incredibly sterile, heavily mechanized, globally integrated, highly polluting supply chain. Our food comes from patents, synthetic nitrogen, and Taylorist efficiency. And yet, our human brains reject that sterility. When we sit down at the dinner table, we don't act like scientists or spreadsheet managers. Our relationship with food remains intensely personal, stubbornly emotional, and deeply cultural.
Right, and this psychological friction brings us to the work of the French anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss. In 1964, he published The Raw and the Cooked. Lévi-Strauss argued that cooking is not just a biological mechanism for calorie extraction, as Wrangham noted earlier. It is the foundational metaphor of human civilization.
What does he mean by that?
The act of taking raw nature and transforming it through the medium of fire into something structured, shared, and distinctly non-animal is how humans conceptually separate themselves from the wilderness.
So cooking is the boundary line between nature and culture. And every society develops a very specific, totally arbitrary set of rules about what crosses that boundary. We develop a culinary grammar. We decide what is eaten raw, what is fermented, what is roasted, and most importantly, what is considered completely taboo and inedible.
And the mechanics of those taboos were brilliantly decoded by another anthropologist, Mary Douglas. She applied structuralist theory to the dietary laws of Leviticus in the Old Testament. For centuries, scholars tried to find rational, hygienic explanations for these strict rules. They argued that ancient Israelites banned pork because pigs carried trichinosis, framing the religious text as basically an early public health manual.
Right, like they somehow knew about parasites. But Douglas looked at the actual text and found the underlying cognitive matrix. She realized the animals that were banned all shared a specific structural flaw. They violated the neat conceptual categories the society had constructed to organize the world.
Exactly. The rules are based on categorical purity. According to Levitical law, a proper, clean land animal must exhibit two traits. It must have a cloven hoof, and it must chew the cud. A cow fits perfectly.
Yeah.
Sheep fits perfectly. They're conceptually safe.
But a pig.
Right. A pig has a cloven hoof and does not chew the cud. It possesses one trait but lacks the other. It straddles the boundary. It is anomalous to the category. It breaks the conceptual order of the universe, and therefore it is deemed impure and taboo.
And the same exact logic applies to the seafood rules. The category for a clean, normal sea creature dictates that it must have fins and scales. A trout is fine. But think about a lobster, a crab, or an oyster. They live in the water, but they lack fins and scales. They are anatomical anomalies. They violate the structure, so they are banned.
Douglas demonstrated that dietary taboos are rarely about physical hygiene. They are about maintaining cognitive and social hygiene. By strictly policing what physical matter is allowed to cross the boundary of the lips and enter the body, a community physically enacts its worldview. You are quite literally ingesting your culture's structural order. It defines the in-group by setting a hard boundary against the out-group who eats the anomalous, chaotic foods.
It's like a societal sorting hat or a cultural immune system, and it anchors our identities with an unbelievable visceral power. Think about the last time you smelled your grandmother's tomato sauce simmering, or the scent of a specific spice blend your family uses during the holidays, or, even just the smell of cheap boxed macaroni and cheese from when you were 7 years old. When that smell hits you, you don't just recall a vague memory. You are physically transported. You hear the voices in the kitchen. You feel the temperature of the room.
We call this a Proustian moment, after Marcel Proust's literary description of a Madeleine cake unlocking his childhood memories. But the mechanics behind this are entirely neurological. The olfactory bulb, the structure in the brain that processes smell, has direct single synapse connections to the amygdala, which is the emotional processing center, and the hippocampus, which is responsible for associative learning and memory.
So it bypasses the normal routing system.
It does. When you see something or touch something, those sensory inputs are routed through the thalamus, a sort of neurological switchboard that processes and filters the data before sending it to the memory centers. Smell does not go through the switchboard. It wires directly into the emotional core of the brain. The smell of a specific cultural dish restores a complete architectural memory with an immediacy that no other sensory input can biologically achieve.
We have this deeply intimate, intensely emotional relationship with what we eat. It defines our families and our memories. But if we connect this to the bigger picture, that intimate relationship is currently colliding head-on with the massive, hyper-efficient, highly concentrated industrial system we just talked about. When you walk into a grocery store, you are standing at the collision point of these two forces.
Right, and managing that collision is the function of the modern global food system. It's a staggering logistical network that coordinates the genetic engineering of seeds, agricultural yields, chemical processing, global shipping, and retail marketing for 8 billion people every single day. And the defining characteristic of this massive network is extreme corporate concentration.
We look down the aisles of a supermarket and see tens of thousands of different brightly colored boxes. The illusion is infinite choice. But behind those different logos, the actual mechanics of the system are controlled by an incredibly small handful of massive corporate entities. It operates like an hourglass. You have millions of farmers at the very bottom, billions of consumers at the top, and a very narrow choke point in the middle, making all the decisions.
And if we examine the mechanics of that choke point, we see monopolies at every single tier. At the base level of agricultural inputs, the literal genetic coding of the seeds, and the proprietary chemical fertilizers and pesticides required to grow them, the global market is dominated by a tiny fraction of agrochemical giants. Companies like Bayer, which acquired Monsanto, Corteva, and Syngenta, hold the patents on the biology itself.
So they dictate terms to the farmers. A farmer often cannot save seeds from year to year. They must legally purchase new patented seeds and the specific chemicals required to grow them every single season.
Yes, and once the commodity crops, the corn, the soy, the wheat, are harvested, they move into the processing tier. Here, mega corporations like Nestle, Unilever, PepsiCo, and Kraft Heinz purchase the raw bulk and engineer it into the thousands of ultra-processed products on the shelves. Finally, at the retail and distribution level, massive entities like Walmart or global food service conglomerates like Yum brands dictate the pricing and availability to the end consumer.
So it's essentially a clash between a highly consolidated, efficient global market system and a movement fighting to protect local traditions. Because this concentration of power allows these entities to exert massive influence over public policy, agricultural subsidies, and crucially, the scientific research regarding the health impacts of their highly processed, high-margin products.
Exactly. We saw this exact playbook written by the sugar industry centuries ago, and it has only been refined. But there is a massive political pushback against this specific model of consolidation. People are not just accepting the hourglass structure. The most prominent organized response is the food sovereignty movement.
What's the core of their argument?
It is a direct political rejection of the idea that food is merely a tradable global commodity to be optimized for corporate efficiency. The core tenet of food sovereignty is that local communities and nations possess the fundamental right to define and control their own agricultural systems and diets.
To understand why this movement is so passionate, especially in places like Latin America and Africa, we really have to look at the mechanics of international debt. For decades, developing nations taking loans from institutions like the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank were subjected to structural adjustment programs, right?
Yes.
And if a country owes debt in US dollars, they cannot pay that debt back by growing yams and cassava to feed their local villages.
Precisely. The structural adjustment programs essentially mandated that debtor nations reconfigure their agricultural sectors. They had to abandon diverse, local subsistence farming that fed their own populations and pivot to growing massive monocultures of cash crops, coffee, cocoa, sugar, or export-grade soy.
Just to get the foreign currency.
Right. These crops generate the foreign currency required to service the international debt, but they leave the local population highly vulnerable to volatile global commodity prices and often require the country to import its own basic food staples.
And the food sovereignty movement is fighting to break that exact mechanism. They are arguing that protecting smallholder farmers, maintaining localized ecological knowledge, and growing food to feed the immediate community must take precedence over the demands of the global export market. It is a battle between food as a caloric commodity and food as a cultural right.
It forces us to recognize that a plate of food is the physical manifestation of a massive web of power dynamics, historical traumas, and systemic engineering.
It is all sitting right there on the plate. But the most incredible part of this entire deep dive is that you don't even need to look at the food to see this history. You just have to look at the menu. Because the history of human conquest, class struggle, and global migration is literally hard-coded into the English vocabulary we use to describe our meals.
Linguistic anthropology provides such a fascinating lens here. The English culinary lexicon is an archaeological record of power and assimilation. The most famous example is the dual vocabulary we use for meat, which dates back nearly 1,000 years to the Norman conquest of 1066.
I love the mechanics of this. A restaurant menu is basically a linguistic archaeological dig. You can tell who conquered who just by looking at the entrees.
You really can. When the French-speaking Normans crossed the Channel and conquered the English-speaking Anglo-Saxons, they didn't just take the land, they instituted a rigid linguistic class divide. The conquered English peasants were forced into agricultural labor. They were the ones out in the mud raising and slaughtering the livestock. So the words for the living animals remained rooted in the Germanic Old English vocabulary of the peasants: cow, pig, sheep.
But the peasants raised the animals, they rarely got to eat the premium cuts.
Exactly. The meat was transported into the great halls and castles to feed the French-speaking Norman aristocracy. Because the ruling class only interacted with the animal once it was prepared and presented on a platter, the culinary dishes adopted the Old French vocabulary. The Anglo-Saxon cow became the Norman boof beef. The pig became pork. The sheep became mouton mutton.
And 900 years later, we are still speaking the exact parameters of that medieval class system every time we order a bacon cheeseburger. The Germanic word is for the barn. The French word is for the banquet.
It's just baked right into it.
But English hasn't just preserved ancient conquests. Because of massive global migration, especially into urban centers over the last century, the English menu has become an absolute sponge for global culture.
It really has. When English-speaking cultures absorb new culinary practices from immigrant populations, they rarely bother to create linguistic approximations. They adopt the terminology whole. Words like croissant, sushi, pasta, taco, hummus, curry, dim sum, pho, pierogi, these are absorbed directly into the daily lexicon.
When you pick up a menu in a major city today, you are reading a highly compressed linguistic map of human migration. You are reading the physical movement of millions of people who packed up their culinary grammars and brought them across oceans.
We began this exploration by noting the deceptive simplicity of a Tuesday night dinner. But tracking the mechanics behind that plate reveals the vast architecture of the human experience.
It really does. The simple act of sitting down to eat connects you to 1.8 million years of evolutionary biology that shrank your gut and expanded your brain. It connects you to the agonizing agricultural trade-offs that stunted our skeletons but allowed us to build cities. It connects you to the geopolitical obsession with flavor that accidentally swapped the flora of two hemispheres and the brutal economic engines of the sugar trade that commodified human life. It connects you to the agrochemical patents that dictate modern farming and to the deep neurochemical memories of your grandmother's kitchen.
And as we move forward, The mechanics of eating are poised for another massive disruption. We are entering an era of precision fermentation and cellular agriculture. We are learning how to cultivate meat from cell lines in bioreactors, completely severing the production of animal protein from the living, breathing animal.
We are decoupling food from nature on a level Levi Strauss couldn't have even imagined. When a steak is grown in a sterile lab instead of a pasture, what new vocabulary will we invent for it? Hundreds of years from now, what new structural taboos, what new Levitical laws will future generations create to decide what is clean and what is anomalous when our food comes from a steel vat?
It's a profound shift in the fundamental technology of human existence. The boundary line between nature and culture is being completely redrawn once again.
Well, we're leaving you with that thought to chew on. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. The next time you sit down to eat, remember you aren't just fueling up. You are participating in the longest, most violent, and most fascinating continuous story ever told. Enjoy your dinner.